the flaming chalice has been lit, and we begin.
Kind of like the Olympics, right?
Begin with a reading, and this reading is the poem written by our speaker Nathan Bakken. This poem is shortlisted for the 2025 Pushcart Prize. Each year, for many decades now, publishers of poetry submit their best poem published during the year to the Pushcart Prize Committee. So the fact that it has been listed for the Pushcart Prize means that Nathan's poem has gotten through two banks of editors, and so it's worth reading. Now, Nathan, in his comments in the Dewdrop Literary Journal, mentions that there are two ways of looking at this poem. It was first conceived as a Christian meditation on the tomb, he says, but after
Kevin, you're saying his.
They, oh, okay, all right. Thank you. Where was I? After the disaster in Palestine, Nathan suggests that we look at it through the prism of that catastrophe. I'm going to suggest this morning that there's a third way of looking at this poem, and that is in terms of waiting for transformation or longing, if we think of a different layer for transformation. The title is Call It Resurrection. A cavern cold and wet waits for warmth. Sunlight hangs on the cracks like illuminated spider webs as high noon soon passes over. The cold body twitches and waits for warmth. Tranquility arrives in the eventually of cards, bread, broken promises, attempts to soothe the waves. Calls this action peace when the body calls it longing. The body does not know we will return, does not know the wails are real. The fear and sadness of abandonment, of survival, are not something to be diminished. And so, as with life, the body quiets, moves from outcry to patient waiting. And I am left to wonder, how does the body yearn when outcry moves to silent tears? Well, Nathan Bakken earned their Master of Divinity at Boston University, where they also earned a master's certificate in conflict resolution in 2017. 2 years later, they were also certified as spiritual director at Still Harbor, an organization dedicated to spiritual training of those on the front lines of justice work, and also to community building. While studying at Boston University, Nathan particularly focused on the spiritual lives of LGBTQA+ people and theologies of liberation. And as you've heard, his poem, Call It Resurrection, is shortlisted for the highly regarded Pushcart Prize. So with that, Nathan, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. That is the first time I've ever heard that poem read by not me. And I'm deeply honored and deeply appreciative of how you read it, and that added layer that you invited us to think on of transformation, longing, And as we kind of enter into our conversation this morning, that theme of longing, of transformation is at the heart of a lot of people's stories about gender. And so before I begin the presentation, I want to say that this presentation in particular came out of a 4-month workshop series I did with Church of the Covenant in Boston back in 2015. And so that obviously 4 months is a lot more space to get into the work of how we tell our stories. But elements of those workshops were then condensed during 2020 when I was invited to do some gender workshops for a Presbyterian church in Baltimore. And so that's where this presentation comes from. And Leah is going to be my so helpful tech person and will be managing the slideshow alongside me. So Leah, we can go to the next slide. And so I want to just give an overview. That's my dog. That's also how I feel. Many of us probably woke up this morning. Her name is Sassafras. But so I want to first just set some norms and expectations of what this workshop's about. Then we're going to break down what is gender, are these components of human identity when we talk about how do we tell our stories of gender. How we tell that story is radically different in 2024 than it was in 2015 when I first created this workshop versus 1999, 1974, all the way back through the history of gender as a human construct. So what is gender section is really breaking down of how are people who do gender scholarship, gender theorists, academics, how are they thinking about what is gender as a human construction? From there, we're going to touch on how does gender connect to our systems of power? That gender is a thing that every human experiences in different ways. Even folks who are agender, who do not have a sense of gender themselves, are impacted by gendered systems. And so all of our stories of gender also touch on power. And then we're going to talk about, when I say what is my story, it's not my story. It is your individual stories. How do you tell your story? And we'll have some time for debrief, some questions. When you walked in, there's over in the corner, there's some note cards and pens. I want sure everybody has a note card and a pen if you're in the room. So as I'm talking, as I'm presenting, if a question pops up for you, write down your question. There will be time for debrief, time for conversation, time for questions at the end of our session. And for that question of what is my story, there's going to be reflection questions. So I want to invite you to just take some notes for yourself. For our friends on Zoom, I trust that you either can use a phone or a laptop or have a piece of paper and a pen nearby. And I invite you to also participate in that way. So that's kind of an overview of our time. And Leah, we can go to the next slide. Gender brings up big feelings. And so before I crack open that conversation, I want to set some norms. One is I do not promise safe spaces. As a trans person leading this room, I am sure I'm going to be asked questions that make me feel uncomfortable. So the space already is inherently unsafe for me. So I don't expect it to be safe for everybody here. So what that does instead is it challenges us to create a brave space. A space where I can be empowered to sit here and answer questions honestly, and a space where you can be brave enough to ask questions honestly, and trust that it's going to be an imperfect space. This is also not a private space. We are recording this. This will be uploaded to YouTube. So if you want to share something personal that you don't want on the internet, talk to me afterwards. Anything that I'm sharing here are things that I have talked about before. So for me, I know what I've signed up for, but I want to make sure as we share, as we debrief, as we ask questions, know that this is not a private space. when people share, when they talk, when I share, when I speak, take time to listen before we all have reactions, we all have responses. If you feel a reaction and response bubbling up, we have note cards. Take a moment to make a note of it. And at the end of the session, check in with yourself and say, do I still want to ask that question? Maybe it got answered along the way. Maybe it's a question to say, I'd rather talk to Nathan privately about that. This is a learning environment, and we are all in different places on the path of learning. This is not a space of perfection. This is a space of practice. So I really want to encourage you to ask imperfect questions. I want to encourage you to acknowledge that everybody here, myself included, is learning in this moment. We are learning from one another. We're not here to police each other, but we are here if something comes up and I say, hey, there's another way to say that, that's more kind, more compassionate, more respectful. I want to invite us to err on the side of kindness, respect, and compassion. And by the end of our conversation, I honestly, you'll probably have more questions than answers. But I hope that you have an idea of when people say gender, they're talking about a big thing. And I hope that you leave here with an understanding that it connects to things that maybe you didn't expect, or maybe for yourself, your own experience of gender, maybe you feel validated, affirmed, heard in a way that you haven't before. And I also want to one of my big takeaways is that the experiences of LGBTQ folks, the experiences of humans under gendered systems are a part of a larger question about power and oppression, and that you leave here being like, actually, patriarchal systems of gender impact all people across genders. It's not just trans people experience it one way, we all have a gender, or even folks who have a gender identity where they have no sense of gender themselves are impacted by gendered systems. So, norms, expectations. This is pronouns. My name is Nathan Bakken. I use they, them pronouns. And I use they, them pronouns because I am a non-binary person. I see myself as not man and not a woman. And given the restraints of the English language, they is the most accessible word for me to best articulate my gender. And so this slide right here, if we had a smaller group, I'd go around and invite everybody to share their pronouns. That will take the entire hour. And so I want to just invite you to take a moment to look at this image. And when you see he, she, her, they, them, him, z, zir, or zg in this image's case, take a note of when you hear the words he, him, or she, her, and you think about yourself, what are the emotions that come up for you? Part of why I settled on they, them is I know how bad he, him makes me feel, and I know how not connected to she, her I feel. I don't feel connected to those words. And so I had to find a word that made me feel connected. So part of this is we all have a gender or lack thereof, and we all have language that needs to be used to connect us to our genders. So we can go to the next slide. This is gender is a human experience. No other organism on Earth has a gender. Gender is a human experience. As organisms have biological sex, but gender is a human construction. And this presentation is deeply informed by Dr. Annalise Singh, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Georgia. And in her essay, Moving from Affirmation to Liberation in Psychological Practice, that essay focuses on, for cisgender or not trans, psychologists, therapists, and counselors, working with trans and gender nonconforming people. Dr. Singh's recommendation is that every cis counselor, therapist, psychologist gets a gender therapist. That it is not just trans people who go on journeys of gender. Every human being goes on a journey with their gender. And to be a provider of care to trans and non-binary people and gender nonconforming people, the therapists themselves should recognize they themselves have gone on a journey, and it creates a well of empathy to be able to hear the stories of trans people. And as a community like UUFNN is, that is welcoming, affirming, inclusive of people across the gender spectrum. For me, as a community leader, I believe it is a responsibility for a community to understand that we all have gendered experiences. That just as a care practitioner recognizes their own gender journey, we ourselves as a community of caring people, when we meet someone, recognize that everybody's had their own individual journeys of their gender. So we can go to the next slide. So what is gender? Gender is a dissertation topic. Gender is an intricate, socially constructed system of histories, linguistics, behaviors, expressions, cultural roles, assumptions that play a role in our culture and in our individual lives. So gender is not just one thing. It is not just being a man or being a woman. It is the systems that tell us what is appropriate clothing for a man, what is appropriate clothing for a woman, what is appropriate hair length for a man, what is appropriate hair length for a woman. And those are informed by our histories, our religions, our geographical locations, our cultural norms. And gender also has a function in society. Gender does things. It's not just an innate thing that's like, oh, I have one. Gender humanizes and it dehumanizes. One of the best ways to dehumanize a person is to call someone it. To remove them by their linguistics of their identity as a human being through the pronoun it as an objectification. So gender is a way that we express humanity, and it is a mechanism that we can use to dehumanize someone. When a trans woman says, I'm a woman, and people insist on calling her he, you're using gender to assert someone else's humanity over them in a way that isn't not in alignment with how they see themselves. Gender also liberates and it oppresses. Gender creates systems that make it feel like certain people can't achieve the rhetoric of the glass ceiling. That eventually you hit a top because of your gender. And at the same time, gender liberates. The feeling, I think, of second wave feminist movements, of bra burnings, of trans people just this past week protesting in a bathroom, advocating for their presence in public space, that they're using gender to also advocate for their own liberation. And so gender, as you'll see, isn't just black and white. It does multiple things. It bounces back. Gender provides euphoria and dysphoria. Oftentimes you hear about gender dysphoria when talking about trans people, but it is not just trans people who experience gender dysphoria. We've all worn an outfit that we do not feel like ourselves in. We have worn clothes that don't make us feel comfortable. We've had haircuts that don't make us feel good. That's gender dysphoria, because the expression of yourself isn't being acknowledged in the way you want to. Gender communicates and it silences important aspects of ourselves. That I know, because of being 6'3", of being 300 pounds, I will never present androgynous. My own biology prevents me from androgyny, because in our culture, a person built like a linebacker is seen like a man. And so gender systems, regardless, I could wear a million dresses, do a full face of makeup every day, and I will still be called he. And I know that because I've done that. And so gender is a way that we communicate to one another. We wear specific clothing, we use specific language, because we're trying to articulate ourselves to the outside world. And we also know that that articulation has a limit. And that there are things about each of us that gender can never truly articulate. Gender also attracts and repulses. Gender touches into desire. I think about in West African communities, physical contact between men and women is really not encouraged. But men show platonic comfort with one another by holding each other's hands with interlocking fingers as they walk down the street. That is not seen as homoerotic. That is not seen as gay. That is how straight men express friendship in those cultures. And so when we think about gender, we know what it feels like to meet someone based on their appearance and say, I'm attracted to them. Or if you're in the case of someone who's asexual, you at least know that society wants you to be attracted to them based on certain components. And in the same way that there are expressions of gender that you say, that's not for me. That is, I don't find that attractive personally. And so we recognize that we use gender to both attract people and it also move people away. To say that I want to attract a certain kind of person. I think about subcultures, goths, scene kids, emos. They're trying to attract a community, build a community in a specific aesthetic. That's using gender in a specific way. Gender is also race and class and sex, that poor women and rich women have very different experiences of womanhood. Rich men and poor men have very different experiences of manhood. White men, Black men, Asian men have different experiences of what it means to be a man within their specific racialized context. So when we talk about gender, we're not just saying, oh, a man is this, because there's infinite definitions of a man based on your social location. And so what gender does is it creates those moments of connection, disconnection, community, abandonment. It does all of those things. So when we talk about gender or gender ideology, being slut shamed for being a woman and wearing a short skirt, that's not an ideology. That is a painful experience. And so when we talk about gender and what,
Sorry, I
yeah.
missed that last sentence. Could you repeat the last sentence?
When someone say is slut shamed or slut shamed, or like demonized for dressing too promiscuously.
Okay.
That is not a gender ideology. It's not an ideology. It is a painful, it's weaponized patriarchal ideologies, but the experience itself is just pain. And so gender does more than just tell us if we're a boy or a girl. It informs a holistic understanding of who we are. And that's not limited to any one gender. And so one of this image up here, we call this the genderbread person. And it's a visual breakdown of how some people and most people who do work in gender studies think and talk about gender. And we're gonna go through, it's typically broken down into these 4 components of biological sex, identity, expression, and attraction. And so we're gonna take a moment to just go through those. So Leah, can you hit the next slide? Oh, there we go. Sex assigned, this is assigned question mark at birth. Biological sex is a colonial framework. It is created from its history out of the colonial project to determine who is a man, who is a woman, informed by the slave trade, to determine what is a breedable person who can reproduce. And from that history, when an infant is born, a medical doctor looks at the genitals of the infant and determines if that child is going to be a boy or a girl. That is what we refer to when we say assigned blank sex at birth, is looks at the genitals, determines that's who that is. And as we've gotten older and as science has developed, we now know that intersex conditions, intersex being the infinite ways that sex and characteristics can manifest in a body, that there's this concept of, oh, you're either male or female, in and of itself is a false binary. that you have people with XX chromosomes who have a penis. You have people who have XXY chromosomes. You have men who develop breast tissue, even though they have XY chromosomes and have to get breast reductions to remove the breast tissue in order to pass as a man, and these are cisgender men. These are not trans men. And so when we talk about sex assigned at birth, the language of identity traditionally is seen as male and female. For the trans community, a way we typically articulate it is assigned male at birth, assigned female at birth. It's just a way to articulate our experiences. And then there's an intersex identity, which is a broad spectrum of an infinite ways that your secondary and primary sex characteristics can manifest. And when we think about intersex people, it's easy to think about intersex people as such a minute minority, when studies show that the global rates of intersex conditions is about the same as the number of redheads on the planet. And so even though it's only 2% of the global population have intersex conditions, that's still a substantial amount of people when you think about 8 billion people on a planet. And so with sex, when we're specifically talking about when you look at someone's body and you look at their genitals, you do the work to look at their chromosomes, you go to an oncologist, you're not an oncologist, hormone doctor. Endocrinologist, thank you. That you look at your hormone levels. Hormones are a great way to articulate like gender, how your expressions of secondary sex characteristics manifest. Body mass, bone structure, and infinite secondary sex characteristics. And we know that these are a spectrum because we all have women in our lives with PCOS who grow facial hair, who have deficiencies in estrogen or overproduction of estrogen. We have women going through menopause who need to go on estrogen patches in order to maintain their sense of self. We have men, cis men, using erectile dysfunction supplements in order to enhance their own sense of self. That there are ways that all people, regardless of gender, use medicalized treatments to affirm their expressions of gender. And so sex assigned at birth, really what we're talking about is the biological pieces. And we can go to the next slide. Sexuality is about desire. Who are you attracted to? And sexuality can be broken up into romantic and sexual desire. That there are people who you think I would never want to date them, but I could imagine a scenario. Or people who say, where you have an experience of, I don't know why I'm so attracted to this person. I've never been attracted to someone like them before, but individual experience draws up desire in unique ways. So we've created language to name these expressions of desire: heterosexuality, homosexuality, bisexuality. And as the internet has unfolded and more people across sexual experiences are in conversation, there's new words being created: pansexual, queer, asexual, demisexual. I'm not gonna do a vocab test. If you have curiosity about what each individual label means, I invite you to Google and have some fun. But part of the identities of sexuality are tied to methods of expression. When we say husband and wife versus spouse, when we say boyfriend or girlfriend or partner, we are using gender and articulating that I'm attracted. If I say my boyfriend, I'm saying something about who my boyfriend is and who I am, all in that sentiment. If I say my partner, it's a big question mark, it's a big mystery. And as somebody who's non-binary, I delight in being a mystery. But we have expressions like marriage, where we have commitments between people to articulate a commitment around desire. And yeah, so we can talk a lot about that. So we can go to the next one. Gender identity. Gender identity is the internal sense of self. It is who you say you are. Nobody can tell you what your gender is. Only you can determine that.
They sure try.
They do try. And in that way, similar with sexuality, as more people have kind of broken apart and been like, oh, there are all these different ways I think about myself. Different language for gender has come up. We have cis man, cis, once again, just means not trans, shorthands for not trans. Men, cis men and trans men, both men. Cis and trans just articulates their experience of their manhood. It's an adjective. And non-binary person, genderqueer person, transgender person, all different ways of expressing their understanding of their gender. Two-spirit people are a specific group tied to Indigenous people of Turtle Islands experience. It's a very new language term. It was created in the 1990s, but it is a way to honor that prior to European colonization, multiple Indigenous tribes across this region and across the country had multi-gendered systems. The histories of gender identities have never been a static man-woman thing. Ancient Judaism had 6 genders. Ancient Greeks, you had eunuchs as its own classified of gender. In Southeast Asia, the Hijra movement of assigned male at birth people expressing femininity, that there's a 3-gendered system dating back 5,000 years in India. And so we have evidence across human expression that gender identity has never been a simple man-woman thing, but over time it's coalesced into that because colonial histories, white supremacies, I can give you a lot of books. But how you identify and navigate your gender identity is unique to you. My experience as a non-binary person is radically different than a non-binary person who is 5'3", a person of color, assigned female at birth, very thin, isn't disabled, that their experience of gender and being what it means to be non-binary is shaped in a way that I don't experience being non-binary. In the same way that my mom's experience of motherhood as a socially liberal, fiscally conservative, mildly Republican woman in Seattle versus Carrie. Different expressions of womanhood and experiences and different pressures of what it means to be a woman. So we'll move to the next one. And this is what frustrates people. Because gender expression is not gender identity. That how you express your gender does not necessarily equate to the gender you identify as. A really beautiful example, butch lesbians. Women who deeply identify as women and are countercultural to gender norms and are butch and are masculine.
I can't see the bloody image.
Sorry, it's Harry Styles in a dress.
Either that or ask you to describe
Yeah,
it.
feel free. And so your gender expression is the communication in which you express your gender. The image on the screen, which is the singer Harry Styles in a very beautiful dress. Harry Styles is a man, identifies as a man, and loves to do photo shoots in dresses. The dress itself is not an indicator of his gender identity, but rather an honoring of how he likes to express his gender. That in his experience, being a man means someone who wears a dress. And so there's different types of expression, there's methods of expression that are based culturally. We still live in a culture where blue means boy, pink means girl. Historically, pink was the color of boys, blue was the color of girls until about the 1940s, and then it switched. But you use the language of gender expression to best express yourself. I wear this purple sweater I inherited from my friend's great aunt because it is my favorite shade of purple, because it best expresses myself. And we do that through religious clothing, through hairstyles, through voice and tone. Everybody has a customer service voice. If you, or and I would say for a lot of queer people and women across the spectrums of womanhood, there's a voice you put on when you want to get your way, or not get your way, but like being like, I'm uncomfortable, so I'm going to like raise up my tone a little bit, I'm gonna be extra nice, and I'm going to express myself in a specific way because I'm either uncomfortable or I know that this is what is expected of me at this time. And so voice and tone are a way you express your gender, and everything is fluid. So we're gonna go to the next slide. And I wanna give you a moment, people on Zoom, people in the room, looking at these spectrums. Where would you locate yourself? And you don't have to share that out loud, you can make a note of it on your note card, but thinking about your gender identity, your gender expression, your biological sex. And when we say things are fluid, when we say things are a spectrum, a woman who is post-menopause has a different relationship with her anatomical sex than a 22-year-old cis woman. How you experience your body is fluid, is a spectrum. And so I'm not asking who you have been, I'm asking today, where do you locate yourself? I'll just give a minute for that. Skip to the next one. When we tell our stories of gender, and these are, I can send out the slideshow, I can give it to, all of these photos are links. We're not gonna take a time, or I'm not gonna read through all of this. But when we tell our experiences of gender, we are also telling the stories of our culture, we're telling the stories of power, and we're telling the stories of oppression. When I first designed this workshop, the opening question is, that when we go around the room and introduce ourselves, is to ask people, what is one thing you love about your gender? What is a piece of your gender that brings you euphoria? And I've taught this workshop a number of times in a couple different contexts, and what always surprises me, queer and trans people almost immediately always have an answer. Women almost always have an answer. Cis men in particular, men who are not trans, I would say 8 out of 10 will say peeing standing up. Because that question is so culturally not asked of men, that for a man to be like, what is the thing about my gender that I've always thought was fun? And peeing standing up, and at the same time, as we just learned, sex is not gender identity. And so I'm like, that is a favorite thing about being a male, but what is your favorite thing about being a man? And it stumps them. And then we go through a couple different workshops, talk about all those things, get in small groups, build relationship. And on the third workshop, we open the space and I say, what is one experience of your gender that has offered you pain? Everyone has a story. Everybody has a story of either, especially for cis men, of either being like, I don't feel like I can access my emotions. I don't feel like I have permission to be vulnerable. I was shamed out of my empathy.
Your what?
Empathy, shamed out of your empathy. And that is when, remember when I said gender liberates and oppresses, that on these news articles are just different stories of gender expression and how they relate to power. And we can go to the next slide. And so when I talk about gender-based oppression, I'm not talking about cis women specifically, and I'm also not talking about trans people specifically. Gender-based oppression impacts all people. If we built the trust in this room over the course of 3 months, and I asked the question, what was a moment of pain in your experience of gender? We would have stories and people would be crying. That is not for a morning at 9 a.m. But I want to just name, when I talk about gender-based oppression, some examples. The racialized gender wage gap. And for me as a trans person, and this is a point of discussion and debate, assigning genders at birth. To look at an infant and say, I know who you are and who you will be. That can be an oppressive experience for trans people as they get older if they're not in an affirming or loving household. Prohibiting transgender people's access to public restrooms, which is really about trans people's access to public space. If I have to only go to the bathroom at my house, how do I navigate my day?
Yeah.
Religious traditions that prohibit women from speaking or teaching. The overturning of Roe v. Wade. Trans people are statistically more likely to experience homicide or suicide. Punishing children who deviate from the cultural norms with regards to their gender expression. When I was 8, my dad used to make me go on walks with him every night because he needed to teach me how to walk like a man.
Yeah.
So gender-based and that, I know that there are cis gay men, there are straight cis men who have that experience of not being man enough, that their family has to take it upon themselves because they feel like they need to because of the soul culture they live in. And it's from a place of fear. And so some buzzwords you'll hear when talking about gender-based oppression, there are some ones you know, maybe some you don't know. Misogynoir is the type of misogyny specific to Black women's experience, that Black women experience a type of misogyny that white women don't. Trans misogyny is a misogyny that trans women experience that cis women don't. Femicide, that there culturally around the world is a long history of the killing of female children out of a fear of having a daughter. Fat phobia, that people of size, fat people, and fat used in this way that's reclaimed by the fat liberation movement, experience gender in ways that thin people don't. That it's gender-based oppression looks so complicated and is so painful because it doesn't just impact one specific gender. And all of these things are interconnected. So we can go to the next slide, because talking about oppression is hard. All people experience gender-affirming care. Gender-affirming care is not just for trans people. Gender-affirming care looks like breast reconstruction, looks like breast reduction, looks like phalloplasties and penile implants, hormone replacement therapy. People across genders use hormone replacement therapy to affirm their genders. Hair transplants, hair removal, gender affirming care. Cosmetic surgeries. One of the distinctions between trans people and cis people, when cis people go in for a plastic surgery consultation, they do not need 3 letters from a psychologist to get a nose job. to get a facelift, to get the same surgeries trans people are looking for, they don't need 3 letters from a doctor in order to access that affirming care. Because to a woman who got a nose job, she viewed herself as my best self as a woman with that nose. Voice therapy. It's not just trans people who go through vocal voice training to get a deeper pitch, a higher tone. Hormone blocking medication. Puberty blockers, which are really big in the news right now, were created for cisgender children. It was created in the 70s for children who were entering puberty too early as a way to delay their puberty so that they would have a more normal experience in middle school and high school. Those children do not need 3 letters from a psychologist to access puberty blockers. Trans children do. And so one of the things with this affirming care, and this is specifically medicalized affirming care, there's a lot of unmedical affirming care. Haircuts, clothing, getting your nails done. All of that is gender affirming care. It is a part of the gender experience and what gives us joy in our genders. My partner, twice a month, goes and gets his nails done because he sees himself, and he's a cis man. The type of man he is a man with nail polish on, because that's how he best expresses himself. And so as we're kind of moving in, and I'm gonna wrap it up soon, so we can move to the next slide. I want you to just take a moment on your note card or at home, and instead of telling the whole story of your gender, I want you to write a 6-word story. 6 words to describe your journey of your gender. I have some examples using my lived experience. Fluid, free, fractured, found, mysterious, whole. If you don't want to write a sentence, you can just write words. Reconnecting with my inner voice's joy. Breaking binaries to find sacred wholeness. Not a man, not a woman. Doesn't have to be complex, doesn't have to be poetic or profound. But I want to invite you to take a moment and just write 6 words that you use to describe your gender. And if you don't have words right now, that's okay. And if you need questions to kind of nurture that reflection, what was your first experience of your gender? When did you feel for the first time like a man or a woman or neither? What have you lost on your journey of gender? What has your faith or faith upbringing taught you about gender? Do you still believe it? We'll go to the last slide, Leah. Why do we need to know this story? Why do you need to reflect on your story of gender? It builds empathy and compassion. It deepens your understanding of your own self. It moves you into authentic relationship with one another. Dr. Singh's study states that when a cis therapist goes through a gender therapy journey, they're better able to empathize, support, listen to their trans clients. Because when a trans person says, I'm frustrated with my access to care as a trans woman, and they're meeting with a cis woman therapist, that therapist can, now has the insider experience of a gender therapist and be like, oh, I'm doing the paperwork. But more so is being able to say, I too have been disgruntled with the healthcare system. of not being heard based on my experience of being a woman. That there are ways for you in your own self-reflection to better hear the stories of others. And it makes us better advocates for ourselves and allies for people who experience different gender-based oppression. And I think the last slide is just additional resources. Oh yeah, we'll do the Q&A. I'll show the resource list later. We have 10 minutes. So yeah, Philip.
So you talked about gender being fluid, and I don't know if you meant that on a societal level or individual level, but one question I have is, for me, because of the way I was raised and the world I grew up in, gender is immutable. It was, whether or not it was assigned at birth, it was God-given or whatever I would say. But there seems to be some more personal fluidity that is possible, and I just appreciate if you could talk about that.
I would say, I mean, gender has never been immutable. The concepts, the expressions, the articulations, the language we use to talk about it have always changed and developed over time. And so I think gender, when I say gender is fluid, I mean it in that like long geologic time scope of what it means to be a man in 2024 is not what it meant to be a man in 2015 by all the way down. And one's personal experience of gender. Oftentimes when people think about gender fluidity, they think of, I'm a man, now I'm a woman, now I'm neither, now I'm a man again. They think the identity is the fluid piece. The identity is not the fluid piece necessarily, it can be. The experience is the fluid piece. That how you're experiencing being a man now has changed over time because of your lived experience. And so part of that fluidity is both the language and the systems and the big ideas, but it's also your personal experience of your own gender is fluid. Regardless if the title has, the identity marker title has changed. And that nuanced piece, one, like, you don't do anything with that, you just say, oh, okay. You acknowledge it with warm appreciation and say thank you, and that's kind of all you can do with it. But I think we live in a society that has told us gender is immutable, when in reality it has never been, because it's easier to try and make something immutable and say that it has been. And there's power dynamics wrapped up in that. Yeah, Bob.
There is this shared experience in our last election. There is a huge amount of our population that will never admit to the existence of a wise woman. And this goes right to gender. I think that is one of the main reasons that the Democrats lost this time, because could not a slightly larger majority and never believed that a woman could have the wisdom to be the president. Whereas I happen to believe that a woman would make a better president because of the wisdom that is colored more by femininity and empathy. Not saying that that is more prevalent in either sex, but and you have to realize too, I was raised in a Unitarian household, and my upbringing was my folks would have dinner parties with, gay people, with trans people. And that was here in Reno. The best friends that Cindy and I had, and with, people that my folks were, associated with, were with, non-traditional, couples. And it gave me a really unique perspective, I think. So we're all still working it out,
Yeah,
so,
no, thank you for sharing.
yeah.
Leah, are there any questions? I see you stepping just a second.
Penny asked who was just speaking, because we couldn't tell online.
I can see what you got.
Bill Fogel was speaking, Penny. She couldn't see her face on the.
All right.
Steffi, you have a question?
Couple,
Yeah.
you said at the beginning that him makes you feel bad, but you don't feel like a she, her. Can you explain more? Why does it make you feel bad? And the other doesn't make you feel good, but is neutral, or
Yeah.
am I hearing incorrectly, or?
Yeah, there's a neutrality to using she, her pronouns. It doesn't fill me with a euphoric sense of this is who I am. And when I say he, him makes me feel bad, it makes me feel like I'm lying. That the why I use they, them pronouns is rooted in this experience that is mine of not feeling he, him not only doesn't tell the whole story, it actually tells a story that I don't think is true. It's a false. If I were to go around using he, him pronouns, I'm not being authentic to myself. And so it feels like I'm lying. And so part of that pain is both the pain of being misgendered and being seen incorrectly. But if I were to, when I don't correct people like I did this morning, because it's early in the morning and I don't have the bandwidth always to correct people, it feels like I'm not being true to who I am.
But when you say they to them, that would imply that you identify with both.
It's separate. So and we can talk, there's a lot of linguistic studies about the psychology and how different gender neutral pronouns are used. So when I say they, them, I'm not thinking it as he and her combined in a word. When I use they, them, it's a separate category altogether. It's neither he nor, yeah, it's neither he, neither her, they,
Okay.
yeah,
I will tell you straightforward, I don't understand,
that's okay.
but then I can't really wrap my mind quite around quantum mechanics either,
Yeah,
but I accept it as true.
yeah, it honestly, that is a great mindset. That gender is quantum mechanics. Yeah.
You know, on that score though, this interesting thing where you separated gender and gender identity. Because I've always seen it, like, remember those old bicycle walks, the 3-wheel bicycle walks?
Yeah.
That's the way I've always seen it, is one is sex, one is gender, and one is who you want to go to bed with.
Yeah.
And gender, in my experience watching people, gender doesn't change. You are who you are, and you can push it down, but eventually something happens. And sex, that can be changed.
Yeah.
So that's the way I've always seen it. But let me ask you a question here. You said that, and perhaps I misheard, You talked about a cis, by the way, where the heck does cis come from?
Cis, so it's an abbreviation of cisgender. And
What is
cisgender, so it's CIS.
What is it?
It's an adjective. It's an adjective that is derived from the word cisgender, which comes from a movement in gender studies in the 90s, where prior to the creation of cisgender, it was trans people and normal people.
Right,
And cisgender is a adjective used to disrupt that, and instead of saying trans people and normal, it's trans people and cisgender people, and both trans and cis are Latin prefixes. Trans meaning across,
right.
and cis meaning same side.
From what word? I'm looking at the etymology.
I don't have the full it's a prefix, so cis is of its own, then it
I'll
gets,
have to look it up. I don't remember that.
Yeah,
from
hey, Nathan, I can jump in if you'd like.
yeah.
This is Latin, CIS is Latin. It's also used in medicine. You might see it in genetics. Cis means on the same side. So cis in genetics means on the same side of that genetic molecule, something has happened. So you might see it in transcription if you do any work in genetics, but it is a Latin phrase, CIS.
Do you happen to remember the Latin word?
I think the Latin word is cis, because it's
Yeah,
not a whole
cis.
word. It's a
Okay.
piece of a word.
I just don't remember that.
Yeah, it's actually,
Latin was
it's actually a chemical
50 years ago.
term originally.
There you go,
Sorry?
It's
yeah.
actually a chemical term originally.
Yes,
Oh.
very common in
And-
organic chemistry.
Yeah,
Refers to the orientation of molecules, whether mirror image of the original molecule or the original molecule itself.
Oh, okay, cool.
yeah.
But you talked about a cis therapist going through a trans journey.
So
That I do not understand.
it's not going through the trans journey. It's a cis therapist getting a gender therapist. So instead of thinking of gender therapists as people who only help trans people, a gender therapist can actually be a resource for all people to be able to understand and reflect on their experiences of gender. And so the cis therapist encourages other cis therapists to have a gender therapist so they can understand what their clients are going through.
So you recommend that cis therapists go to?
A gender therapist, yes. If they want to support trans people.
Go to versus having coffee with them and sharing.
No, I like go into practice, like hire a therapist.
I don't see the logic.
That's okay, we can talk about it more stuff. It's has to do with building empathy, like the experience to have better empathy and understanding for what their trans clients go through. So it gives the therapist a window into the questions a gender therapist asks, into the methodology and the practice of gender therapy. So that way when a therapist is sitting with a trans person, they're not just flying by the seat of their pants. They have an experience of what that person is also going through. Yeah.
What's your perception of where Unitarian Universalism is on its journey of the fully appreciating and empowering and giving representation on our boards of the full gender expression?
In Unitarian Universalism, there are two ways I want to answer that question. One is Unitarian Universalism in the context of American religion. In the context of American religion, looking at other denominations, looking at other religions, Unitarian Universalism is the forefront of that conversation. We have more trans ministers ordained within our tradition than any other religion in the United States. And the first trans minister was ordained in the early 80s in Unitarian Universalism. The first trans minister hired by a congregation was in 2002.
In the 80s to 2000.
Wow. And so there are like Unitarian Universalism has a large trans population within it. And when we look at, because of our congregational polity, each congregation has its own way of doing things. The equity extended to trans individuals, I think would be a case by case basis. There are resources, trans mission, trans ministry, Transcendent Heart Collective, are all different UU trans-based ministries, that get at that. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a probably kind of straightforward question, but as a cis hetero man, and like in my last relationship, I remember, my partner, she was in her 40s, I was in my 30s, we thought calling each other boyfriend, girlfriend sounded silly,
Yeah.
honestly.
Yeah.
So we said partner, and at one point I remember having a gay friend being like, oh, like, and then I was like, oh yeah, she's, we're straight. And is there an issue, do you find an issue with that? You did mention a sense of mystery when someone says partner, but like for us, it was just a better way of describing each other. But I just wanna make sure I don't like to, assume things or like take things over from.
There's a lot of Twitter threads that would have a lot of different opinions. I personally am not invested in that type of like language policing.
Okay.
That said, I do think when straight people use partner, I think part of that acknowledgement is, oh, I am joining like a linguistic tradition that comes out of gay and lesbian community. Where like, one of the mystery, the delight in it is that like, oh, people will assume that your significant other might be a man. And I delight in that mystery. I'm like, oh, I'd rather delight in not knowing who you are and discovering that alongside you than wanting you to tell me exactly who you are up front. Yeah.
Just to add on to that, it's interesting, Dave's been involved in Rotary for many, many years, and in like 2005, they changed from spouse to partner. And this is an international organization.
I wonder if it's to open it up to not just married people?
Well, it was with the trans.
Oh.
I think it was.
Yeah.
And a lot of people were very upset about it. It was not an easy change, but that was early 2000.
I do want to be mindful of time and that we are 10 minutes over, and I apologize for that.
Well, it's not your fault. But it's the rebellion you
I know.
have inspired.
I welcome the rebellion.
So the rebellion against time.
Before we close, Leah, are there questions in the chat at all that I?
No questions in the chat, Nathan, just, everyone acknowledging that they have loved your presentation and that this should go for another session, another time. So thank you so much.
Yeah, maybe in the future, I'll do the whole workshop series and give people the space to sink their teeth into it. But
Well,
thank you.
I think you deserve some applause.
And I will send you on the last slide of the slideshow is if you want to learn more, like resource list of both books, visual media, both nonfiction and fiction that I can send out to you and you can disperse to folks.
Well, one comment I would have about this is that those of us who are cis or cisoid haven't had to think about our gender. So I want to thank you for making us think about it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of the few things that connects us all.
Right.
Kevin, and coming up, next forum?
It's so far in the future.
You bother the announcement, all right?
Thank you, and thank you, Leah, for running tech.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Bye. Bye.
Charlotte says bye too. Bye.
Bye.
And then